Behind me begins the Gallery of Arms. Almost 2 kilometers long, it is one of the many infrastructures that make up the Battipaglia-Potenza line. Immersed in nature, challenging the gorges created by the Platano River. It is tragically a witness to what is the largest railway disaster in Italy and very likely in Europe. A tragedy that saw the loss of more than 600 people on March 3, 1944. This is the story of Train 8017, the story of the Balvano disaster. Christ stopped at Eboli. Not only those who have read the book, but also those who have traveled beyond this Campanian city know well what is being referred to. The roads are more winding. The mountains are much steeper and carved. On the sides of them, there are deep gorges like this one, like the gorge of the Platano. Building infrastructure in such a territory has always been a challenge, and the gradual construction of a railway that from Battipaglia, and therefore actually from Naples, set off to go to Potenza and then again to Metaponto. To Taranto on the Adriatic side, it has been of vital importance for the Potenza region. However, compared to the sea, it is at a height of 819 meters, and climbing up to this height for a train is not at all easy. For a purely technical reason, the tracks cannot exceed a certain degree of inclination. In particular, the Italian technical limit is 33 per 1,000, or 33 meters of ascent for every 1,000 meters traveled horizontally. It seems like a lot, but if you think about it, normal rubberized roads have slope values much higher than 20-25%, not even per 1,000. So we realize how a very steep climb for a train can seem very light for a car. Trains have to climb slowly. And in Italy, as in the rest of the world, in the design of railway lines, local geography and topography are exploited to the maximum. The gorges in the mountains carved by rivers naturally serve this purpose, because obviously the rivers go slightly downhill. And these gorges therefore follow a slight downhill or uphill slope. Building a railway along such a gorge and following what Mother Nature tells us, look, this is the gentlest slope. Passing through these parts is not the most direct link between Naples and Potenza, but certainly the most feasible link for heavy vehicles like trains. And by following this ragged path in these gorges, it was also advantageous for the builders who completed this line towards the end of the 19th century. Today, Balvano station appears desolate. There is no permanent staff and only 3 trains stop there each day. Numerous ones are in transit from Intercity to Frecciarossa, from Rome to Taranto, testifying to the importance of this infrastructure. In 1944, however, the situation was different. The line was always single track, but the traction was not electrified. Electrification will only arrive in 1994. At the time on this route, the traction was obviously steam, and the method of communication to control the movement of trains was through the use of the telegraph. There was no phone in this station. The original station building, this and the new one, was destroyed by the Irpine earthquake in 1980s. It was 2 stories and was completely inhabited 24 hours a day by the numerous, especially for the time, staff necessary for the direction and maintenance of the trains. 44, as we surely well know, is also one of the years that sees the Second World War. Italy, after the armistice of September 8, was divided, and here was the so-called Kingdom of the South. An administration led by Badoglio and the king, not particularly respected by the Anglo-Americans, but still used to administer large pieces of territory and population. In fact, the Allies dumped all the civil, non-strategic problems on this Italian administration. In fact, nothing more than a thorn in the side in trying to conduct the war on the peninsula. The fighting at Anzio and Cassino was what interested the Allied administration, while problems such as the hunger of the population, the reconstruction of infrastructure, the operation of public services like transportation, post telegraphs were almost irrelevant. According to the terms of the armistice, all ports, all internal connection systems, so roads and railways, were at the disposal of the Allied command. Before this provision, before the armistice, this line was regularly traveled by passenger trains and freight trains. There were many trains that, leaving from Naples, arrived in Potenza at night and returned during the day. This is because the food situation in Potenza and throughout Lucania, as it was then called, was decidedly better than that in the Campanian capital. Therefore, there were many people who, leaving from Naples, Salerno, the large cities of the Campania coast, came here to Lucania to buy food on the black market. In fact, the rations that were given first by the fascist government and then by the Allies were definitely not enough. Therefore, it was tolerated both by the fascist regime and the Allied government. And it provided food and work for many people who otherwise would not have been able to survive. In Potenza or in Basilicata in general, in fact, the prices were up to 5 times lower than those that could be found in Naples. However, after the armistice, the number of trains passing through here was absolutely insufficient to meet the needs of the population. There was a bi-weekly service for a passenger train that didn't even remotely fill the transportation needs of these people who were going to the markets in Potenza. So many, therefore, necessarily climbed clandestinely onto freight trains. These were dangerous journeys, often in bad weather, with public order problems at various stations. However, many, in order to live, challenged tunnels like this one, crammed onto every kind of wagon. You'll forgive me if the locomotive behind me is smaller and older. It's definitely not the correct one. But it doesn't change at all the sense of what I want to tell you. Being an engineer on such a machine was very difficult, and the Battipaglia-Potenza route was notoriously difficult and dangerous. In fact, there had already been fatal accidents before, almost as a warning of what was about to happen. The 8017 train officially leaves Naples at 1 post meridian officially. It's just a freight train, it only has cargo, there are no people on board. In reality, there are already hundreds of people who want to get to Potenza and Lucania. Once it arrives in Salerno, it will have to have a locomotive change. It started with an electric engine, but like here, the line is not electrified and will need a locomotive change. So a steam engine will be attached. The model 476 number 023, a powerful mountain engine suitable for climbing these steep slopes. An engine actually of Austro-Hungarian origin obtained by Italy as a repair for the First World War. However, before leaving from Salerno, an event occurred that will have very serious consequences on this journey. In fact, another locomotive comes, the La Model 480 number 016, which was supposed to go to Potenza. So it was decided to add it to the heavy train to go to the capital of Lucania, thus killing 2 birds with 1 stone, so to speak. However, for reasons that have not been better explained, these locomotives, instead of being attached to the end of the convoy, as was customary when there were 2 steam locomotives, was attached in front of the already present engine. Other people continue to board the train, which departs for Battipaglia at 5:15. Post-meridium, more people get on at Battipaglia. But above all, 24 wagons are added. At this moment, the train has 47 wagons and more than 700 people have boarded the train illegally. Thus, the train begins its slow climb towards Eboli, Sicignano, Bucino, ascending more and more into the evening that was turning into night towards the gorges of Platano itself. According to the investigation after the accident, what was done in Battipaglia directly violated the provisions of the military railway service, the Allied body that controlled the railways, which prescribed that on this route, the trains that traveled it could not exceed 350 tons in weight. And the chief inspector of the state railways, questioned after the accident, said that this prescription, this reduction from 470 tons to the expected 350, was also made because of coal. Before September 8, Italy used high-quality German coal, but after September 8, the Allies will provide the Kingdom of the South with low-quality coal from Yugoslavia. This coal was really dirty and of very low quality, and the steam engines simply couldn't develop enough power. The train, on the other hand, officially weighed 520 tons. In reality, a later calculation would reveal that it exceeded 600, not counting the 30 tons of stowaway passengers it carried. Why was this arrangement ignored in Battipaglia? Well, because this arrangement specifically referred to trains with 1 engine. Now, train 8017 had 2. With such a long and heavy train, however, they should have at least arranged them differently, 1 in front and 1 in the back, not both in front. This choice will be fatal. The weapons gallery is narrow, has a slope of almost 13 per 1,000, and is nearly 2 kilometers long. Not only had it been constantly raining up until that moment, not one of those powerful rains, but one of those mixed drizzles, even with snow that lasted for days. The humidity filled every pore of this gallery. Train 8017 arrives at Romagnano, the station, before Balvano at 22:45. Here it will have to stop for more than an hour. In fact, there was a problem with locomotive 480 due to the very poor quality coal, as we said, coming from Yugoslavia. The locomotive needed cleaning. It wasn't exerting enough power. It was dirty, and the locomotive had to be cleaned as much as possible. Other people are getting on the train at this moment, mainly in the front cars. The cars that are hooked up front, the ones that left from Naples, are mainly covered. It's cold, it's March 3rd, it's night, most people are there taking shelter. The train arrives right here in Balvano, 12 minutes after midnight. It remains stationary for other necessary operations. Departing for the last time at 12:50 a.m. on March 3rd, 1944, continuing to climb the gorges of the Platano with its bridges and its tunnels. The station master of Balvano signals the departure of the train to that of Bellamuro. How did this thing work? The stations were connected by telegraph, and each station was responsible for the upstream and downstream section for the safety of the train passage. What was done was to telegraph every time a train left the station to coordinate the passage of various trains. Once this signal was made, the train left for Bellamuro, and the station master of Bellamuro, once the train had arrived, had to signal again back to Balvano that the train was indeed present, and therefore the stretch of railway between the two stations was free. Considering the route, the mass of the train, the conditions, this journey is done in 20 minutes. Today's modern trains take 10. At 2 in the morning, more than an hour after departure, Balvano telegraphs to Bellamuro asking, "Has it arrived?" The train had not arrived. No one was sure what had happened, and the truly disturbing thing was that nothing was done. The train struggled to accelerate, the power was poorly distributed, the weight was excessive, the fact that the wheels and tracks were wet and therefore these wheels were slipping. This train arrives at the entrance of the Armory Gallery, traveling no faster than 10.9 miles per hour. The machine staff, very aware of the smoke problem in the galleries, cover their faces with a wet handkerchief. The train enters the tunnel, but after about 100 meters it suddenly starts to slow down. 500 meters from here, from the entrance of the tunnel, it comes to a complete stop. In the narrow tunnel, the oxygen is rapidly depleted by the fires of the two engines, but that's not all. Two facts worsen the situation. The first is that there is no wind. This tunnel has not been ventilated. It has not been ventilated, especially when an hour earlier another freight train passed, this time more empty, with fewer people, but also with two engines. This last train barely left the tunnel, however, leaving a lot of fumes and consuming a good part of the oxygen present here. Carbon monoxide and carbon dioxide quickly fill the lungs of the staff and passengers. Most are sleeping in the wagons. The fireman of the 480, the lead engine, faints from the fumes and falls from the train onto the track. Incredibly, he will be the only one of the driving staff of the two locomotives who will survive this ordeal. So many of the details of what happened are based on his testimony. The staff must react very quickly. The engineer of the 480 gives maximum forward power to try to get out of the tunnel. At that moment, he also faints and starts choking. However, fatefully, the locomotive behind the 476 tries to do exactly the opposite. The engineer reversed the gear to back up, but before opening the valve to give power, he too collapsed due to carbon monoxide. If he had succeeded, probably the 476, with its greater power than the 480, would have been able to back up the train. It obviously helped that the tunnel is on a slope, and even though the 480 was pushing forward, the greater power of the 476 probably would have beaten it. Unfortunately, the engineer collapsed before he could do this. The account of this tragedy I based mainly on this excellent book by Gianluca Barneschi, The Forgotten Disaster, which I highly recommend to anyone who wants to delve deeper into this story. I'll add the link in the description. Especially the part that concerns what happened after, due to the contradiction of many witnesses, is very confused. The fact is that in the confusion, it's not clear who. But one of the train's brakemen reached Balvano station on foot at 5:10 in the morning. 4 hours have passed. The most disturbing and incredible thing seems to be the very slow reaction of the train masters to the fact that a train had disappeared. Balvano and Bellamuro kept telegraphing each other. because they both had trains to send forward, but no one raised any alarm about where the train had ended up. 8017. The station master of Bellamuro. In the investigation, he will state that he was not worried because often the trains took more than 4 hours to travel this route. One has to wonder how a 20-minute route becomes, and if it really lasted 4 hours, why there were no other incidents of this kind. Regardless, at 5:10 in the morning, the train, which had been stopped in the tunnel for 4 hours, finally receives a first alarm. Here at Balvano, the locomotive of train 8025, which had been waiting there for hours, was detached from Balvano. And at 5:25 in the morning, it stopped right here, just reaching the tunnel. The immense tragedy was immediately clear to everyone. The 8025 returned to Balvano, and finally, 4 hours after the train had stopped in the tunnel, the Save Our Souls was given. With the arrival of the morning and the rising of the wind, and also the end of the fire in the 2 locomotives, which, however, remained lit. All this time, you can enter the tunnel and you can start to rescue those who have survived. Most of the survivors are in the last wagons, further away from the locomotives inside the tunnel. Many are fleeing, they are illegal, and they fear the police. In a few hours, rescue convoys will arrive. One will come by rail from Salerno, another from the far north from Potenza. The first report of deaths is the number 402. The cause is only one: asphyxiation. The tunnel had become a gigantic gas chamber, killing hundreds of people with carbon monoxide. The trucks brought to the Balvano station by the Allied military government shuttled between the station and the cemetery. Too many bodies to bury in too little time. Most will be interred right here in mass graves. However, many were those who had relatives here in the area and whose bodies were recovered by them. So an exact count of the victim has always been very difficult. Various sources report many different data. The figure of 402 is from the very first report made by the Carabinieri of Balvano. But witnesses who participated in the rescue, whose job was, for example, to number and label the bodies, speak of other numbers. It ranges from a minimum of 626 to 722, according to one source. Today, the dead of this terrible disaster are remembered here in this chapel erected in their memory. Above their bones, Balvano represents the darkest tragedies of Italian history. A dramatic event that caused the death of more than 600 people, all innocent civilian victims due to human negligence. This disaster should be remembered to honor the victims and as a future warning. Indeed, we must learn from the mistakes of the past to ensure the future safety of our travels and our infrastructure. Thank you for your attention. I am Vlad Shoots History. As always, see you next time.